Most people believe their bodies are falling apart because the calendar says they are another year older. RUI discovered that everything changes the moment you realize your flesh and bone are merely adapting perfectly to a lifestyle that asks them to do absolutely nothing. He stood in the center of the damp dojo, his breath shallow, staring at a simple wooden chest containing his grandfather's iron-hilted katana. When he reached down to lift it, his lower spine seized, a dull, familiar ache radiating through his hips that forced him to pause, catch his breath, and compromise with the simple gravity of a 20-pound weight. He was not old, yet his ankles felt like dried pine. His knees creaked like the heavy oak doors of the temple during a storm, and his shoulders hung forward like a peasant carrying wet straw. Master Suzhen watched him from the shadows of the paper screen, his own spine straight as an arrow, sitting effortlessly on his heels without a single cushion to soften the floor. For 3 seasons, RUI had hidden his growing stiffness, assuming that the slow, creeping prison of his joints was simply the toll of time, an inevitable decay that claims every man who passes his 3rd decade. He planted an open loop in his mind. How could Suzhen, a veteran of 7 campaigns whose skin was like weathered leather, drop into a deep, flawless squat to inspect a blade, while men half his age required a wooden bench just to lace their sandals? The answer was not hidden in a secret medicine or an esoteric scroll, but in a profound mistake RUI had been making since the day he traded the wild, uneven mountain paths of his youth for the flat, unyielding floors of the provincial capital. The pain was not an injury, nor was it a sickness. It was the silent testimony of a structure that had been systematically starved of its natural purpose. Ren, the local physician who traveled between the grand estates of the daimyo and the muddy valleys of the rice farmers, sat by the low fire and unrolled his parchment. "The wealthy men of the court come to me crying of locked hips and frozen shoulders," Ren said, dipping his brush into dark ink. "They travel in silk-lined carriages. They sit on elevated chairs imported from the Western traders, and they sleep on mountain pile bedding that mimics the softness of a cloud. They believe their wealth buys them comfort, but it is buying them a gilded paralysis." RUI leaned against a wooden pillar, rubbing his aching lower back. "And the farmers, the men who clear the ditches." Ren smiled, the firelight catching the lines around his eyes. "The farmers do not own chairs. They eat on the earth, they kneel to tend the barley, and they squat to relieve their bowels. Their joints are asked to be joints every single hour of their lives. The body does not rot from use, RUI. It rots from being spared all effort." That evening, RUI looked at his room with new eyes. He saw the raised cot he had purchased to escape the cold draft of the floor, the low stool he used while cleaning his armor, and the perfectly level gravel path he had cleared from his doorway to the dojo gate. He had systematically removed every obstacle, every variance, and every deep bend from his daily existence, creating a world so perfectly flat and comfortable that his muscles had simply forgotten how to operate in 3 dimensions. But that was only the surface of the problem. The real transformation began when RUI realized that his training sessions inside the dojo were completely insufficient to undo the 23 hours of stagnation outside of it. He had fallen into the modern trap of believing that 1 hour of intense, violent exercise could cancel out a day spent sitting completely still. Master Suzhen stepped into the morning light, holding a damp cloth and a small vial of clove oil. He did not pick up a practice sword. Instead, he knelt before his old armor rack, moving each iron plate with a slow, circular deliberation that looked more like a dance than a military preparation. A warrior who only cares for his blade during the hour of battle will find it rusted in its scabbard when the scouts sound the alarm. Sujin murmured, his voice low and rhythmic. You come here to strike the straw post until your knuckles bleed, but you spend the rest of your day shaped like a broken branch. Rui took a step forward, his knees emitting a sharp, audible pop that echoed through the quiet courtyard. My joints feel as though they are filled with sand, master. If I train harder, will the fluid return? Sujan stopped his cloth, looking up with eyes that had seen 40 winters of siege. You cannot force oil into a dry gear by spinning it at full speed, apprentice. You will only break the teeth. You must turn it slowly, gently, before the fire is lit. He rose in one fluid motion, without using his hands, his feet gripping the smooth timber of the floor with an organic stability that made Rui feel clumsy. The master wasn't displaying supernatural power. He was demonstrating the baseline function of a human animal that had never been permitted to settle into the lazy geometry of a chair. To fix the machine, Rui had to begin at the foundation, with a habit the samurai called seiza, the posture of absolute rectitude that every young warrior was forced to endure until it became second nature. The next morning, before the sun had cleared the bamboo ridge, Rui dropped his shins to the wooden floor, flattened the tops of his feet against the grain, and tried to lower his hips onto his heels. Within 10 seconds, a burning wave of agony surged through his anterior tibialis muscles, and his ankle joints screamed as if they were being twisted by an interrogator's rack. His thighs tightened like pulled bowstrings, and his lower back began to round in a desperate attempt to escape the tension. Keep your crown reaching for the sky, Sujan commanded, placing the flat of his wooden scabbard against Rui's spine. The pain you feel is not damage. It is the language of your forgotten limits. The chair has shortened your tendons and locked your ankles into a permanent right angle. You are breaking the stone that has hardened around your joints. Rui gritted his teeth, his breath ragged. How long do we stay like this? Until you can hear the birds without thinking of your knees, Sujan replied calmly. For the first week, Rui could barely manage 2 minutes without his legs turning into numb blocks of wood. To survive, he followed Ren's medical counsel, placing a tightly rolled hemp towel beneath his ankle joints to take up the space his stiff ligaments couldn't bridge, and a thick woolen blanket between his thighs and calves. It was a humiliating concession for a man who fancied himself a martial artist, but within 20 days, the space dissolved. The ankles surrendered their decades of stiffness, the quadriceps lengthened, and Rui found he could sit in perfect seiza for 5 minutes while drinking his morning tea, his spine aligning itself naturally over his pelvis without a single muscle straining to hold the position. What Rui found next made the first lesson feel incomplete. Ankle mobility was merely the gateway. The true restoration required a systematic awakening of every major intersection in the skeletal architecture before the mind became entangled in the worries of the day. This was the ritual of Ragio Taiso, a collective mobilization that Sujin insisted was more critical than any tactical manual. Every single morning, before the rice was boiled or the swords were checked, Rui stood in the misty yard and spent exactly 3 minutes performing slow, non-strenuous, circular movements. He began with his neck, rolling his head in vast, lazy orbits, then moved to his shoulders, rotating his arms like the sails of a coastal windmill. He twisted his spine from side to side, allowing his arms to flop loosely against his ribs, before dropping his hands to his knees to guide them through gentle circles. Why do we not stretch until it hurts? Rui asked one morning, his shoulders crackling like dry twigs as he swung his arms across his chest. Should we not force the tissue to lengthen? Ren, who was gathering morning herbs near the well, answered instead. When you pull a cold rope with sudden violence, it snaps. Your joints contain a sacred water, the synovial fluid. When you remain still through the night, that water becomes thick and stagnant, like old pond ice. These gentle circles are not a test of strength. They are the hand that stirs the pond. You are warming the oil so it can coat the iron. RUI noticed that after these 3 minutes of circular mobilization, the heavy, stone-like lethargy that usually plagued his first 2 hours of waking vanished entirely. It wasn't the false energy of a stimulant or the frantic heat of a sprint. It was the clean, quiet functionality of a well-oiled mechanism. He realized that the samurai didn't oil their blades after the rust appeared. They oiled them daily so the rust could never find a home. His joints worked by the exact same law. The third pillar of his reconstruction was the absolute destruction of his furniture, a radical step inspired by the legendary longevity of the Southern Island clans who remained agile into their 10th decade. Under Sujan's guidance, RUI dragged his wooden cot, his stool, and his elevated table out to the central courtyard and set them ablaze. The smoke rose over the tile roofs, carrying away the modern comforts that had been slowly cementing his hips into an early grave. From that hour onward, his life existed on the floor. If he wished to eat, he had to descend into a deep kneel or a cross-legged seat. If he wished to read his journals, he had to rest his elbows on the tatami mats. If he wished to rest, he had to continuously shift his weight from his left hip to his right, adjusting his position every 10 minutes as his body negotiated with the hard timber. "The floor is an unyielding master," Sujan remarked, watching RUI struggle to find comfort during their midday meal of pickled radish and rice. "A chair allows your core to die. It takes the burden of your weight and leaves your spine to hang like a slack clothesline. The floor offers no such mercy. It demands that your trunk remain active, that your hips remain open, and that you change your posture 30 times a day just to remain at ease." Ruai wiped the sweat from his forehead as he shifted from a cross-legged position to tatahisa, the tactical posture where one knee is raised and the opposite foot is flat. "My hips feel as though they are being pried open with iron wedges, master." "Good," Sujin said, his own posture immaculate as he lifted his bowl. "Every time you climb up from the dirt, and every time you lower yourself back down, you are performing the most ancient movement pattern known to our kind. You are performing a full-body assessment that preserves your independence. A man who cannot get off the floor without assistance is no longer a free man. He is a prisoner of his environment." Within a month of floor living, RUI noticed an incredible change. His core muscles felt continuously firm. His digestion improved because his abdominal cavity was no longer compressed into a permanent slouch, and the chronic ache in his sacrum had completely dissolved into a feeling of deep, muscular stability. The transformation took an even stranger turn when Sujin stripped RUI of his thick-soled leather sandals and ordered him to walk across the raw terrain of the mountain pass with completely naked feet, an exercise the master referred to as hadashi. For 30 years, RUI had encased his feet in protective wrappers, believing that a thick, cushioned sole was the ultimate expression of care for his limbs. Now, as his bare soles made contact with the cold, wet gravel, the jagged schist, and the soft, treacherous moss of the forest floor, his entire body suffered a massive neurological shock. Every nerve ending in his arches fired simultaneously, sending an absolute torrent of electrical signals up through his calves, into his knees, and directly to his cerebellum. "Your foot contains 26 separate bones and more than 30 joints," Ren explained, walking beside him in simple split-toe cloth socks. "They were designed to grasp the earth like the hand grips the sword hilt, but your sandals have turned your feet into dead blocks of wood. The muscles have withered, the arch has collapsed, and because your foundation is dead, your knees and lower back must perform the work your feet are ignoring. Rui winced as his heel came down on a sharp cedar root. It feels as though I am learning to walk for the first time in my life. My ankles are wobbling constantly. Let them wobble, Sujin interjected from the front of the trail. That movement is your nervous system waking up. The small muscles of your soul are rediscovering how to balance, how to contract, and how to distribute the impact of your weight. If you do not let your feet feel the earth, your spine will bear the brunt of every stride. Rui persisted, spending 10 minutes every afternoon walking through the rough grass of the meadow and across the polished stones of the riverbed. The initial sensitivity was intense, but by the third week, the skin on his soles thickened without becoming calloused or coarse. His toes spread out, creating a wide, powerful platform that anchored him to the ground. He realized that his balance had improved dramatically. When he practiced his sword forms, his stance felt rooted to the center of the world, unshakable, because his feet were finally communicating with the surface beneath them. The next discipline required him to abandon the smooth, flat roads of the town entirely, seeking out the most chaotic, irregular paths he could find to engage in what the old texts called the spinal reset. Modern paths were built for commerce, straight, level, and predictable, but the human spine was built for the wilderness. For 20 minutes each day, Rui climbed through the old, unmaintained mountain trails behind the temple, where every single step was completely different from the last. One foot would land on a sloping rock, forcing his ankle into deep inversion. The next step would require a long lunge over a fallen log, opening his trailing hip. The step after that would hit a soft patch of mud, demanding an instantaneous adjustment from his deep abdominal stabilizers. "Watch how the willow grows on the cliffside," Sujin said, his voice cutting through the rustle of the bamboo leaves. "It bends forward, it twists to the side, it leans backward to catch the sun. Your spine must move in all 6 directions every single day if it is to remain green. If you only walk on flat stones, your vertebrae will stack like dry porcelain plates, compressing until the cushions between them turn to dust." Rui leaped across a small drainage ditch, twisting his torso slightly to maintain his center of gravity. "I can feel my lower ribs moving against my hips, master. I did not realize how rigid my torso had become." "A rigid spine is the first sign of death," Sujin said, not turning back. "The old man shrinks because his spinal discs have dried out from lack of varied movement. When you force your body to navigate this broken terrain, you're pumping water back into those dried sponges. You're keeping the column fluid. The daily 20-minute trek across the rough landscape worked like a mechanical chiropractor. The subtle, continuous micro-adjustments required by the uneven ground loosened the deep, intrinsic muscles of Rui's back that had been locked in a permanent defensive spasm from years of desk work and linear walking. He returned from the mountain trails feeling taller, his chest open and his breath moving, with an ease he hadn't experienced since his boyhood. To protect this newly recovered spinal mobility, Rui had to develop an internal wall of iron, an ancient core conditioning discipline known as Fukin Undo. This was not the superficial training of the mirror-gazing actors who sought a shredded abdominal wall for vanity. It was the deep, visceral engagement of the transverse abdominis and the pelvic floor, the structural girdle that keeps the pelvis connected to the rib cage under extreme physical duress. Every afternoon, Rui lay flat on his back on the hard wooden floor of the dojo, pressed his lumbar spine down so forcefully that not even a single blade of grass could be slid beneath it, and lifted his heels exactly 6 inches from the timber. "Do not let the lower back leave the wood," Sujin warned. standing over him with his arms crossed inside his massive sleeves. The moment your back arches, your spine is taking the load, and you are reinforcing the very damage the chair has caused. Use your breath to cement your navel to the floor. Ruai's entire abdomen began to tremble violently within 15 seconds. The muscles deep within his groin and across his lower stomach burned with a cold, intense heat. "My breath is locking in my throat, master," he gasped. "Then you are failing," Sujan said sternly. "If you cannot breathe while your core is engaged, you cannot fight and you cannot live. The core must be stone, but the lungs must be wind." He endured 3 repetitions of 30 seconds each day, a mere 3 minutes of total practice that felt more exhausting than an hour of sword sparring. But the results were undeniable. The deep, muscular wall he built, acting as an internal brace, taking the constant pressure off his lumbar vertebrae. When he lifted heavy water buckets or handled the iron-hilted sword, his lower back no longer bore the strain. Instead, the force was transferred seamlessly through a rock-solid midsection down into his powerful, awakened legs. This internal armor was completed by the mastery of hara breathing, the art of the abdominal expansion that turns every breath from a source of spinal compression into a tool of structural decompression. Rui sat on the floor, his hand resting 2 inches below his navel, realizing with a sense of shame that his chest had been doing all the work for years. His shoulders used to rise and fall with every breath, his neck muscles straining to pull oxygen into the top third of his lungs, a shallow, frantic pattern that signaled permanent emergency to his nervous system. "You breathe like a trapped bird, Rui," Ren observed, sitting opposite him and placing his hand on his own lower belly, which expanded outward like a gentle wave with every inhalation. "When you breathe into your upper chest, you compress your cervical spine 20,000 times a day. You pull your shoulders into your ears, and you tell your brain that you are under attack. True power lives in the hara." Rui closed his eyes and attempted to direct the air deep into his pelvis, keeping his shoulders completely still and his collarbones dropped. "It feels as though I am trying to push air through solid clay." "Relax the jaw," Ren advised. "Inhale through the nose for 4 counts. Let the belly swell like a wine skin. Hold it for 2 counts, then let the breath leak out through your lips for 6 long counts, drawing the navel back toward the spine. Feel your ribs widen like an opening fan." Repractice this 3 times a day, 5 deep, deliberate breaths every morning, noon, and night. The effect on his nervous system was instantaneous. A profound, cool calm descended over his mind, and the chronic tightness in his upper traps and neck vanished as if a heavy iron yoke had been lifted from his neck. Each breath was no longer a mini compression of his vertebrae. It was an internal massage that separated his ribs and elongated his trunk from the inside out. Before any major movement practice could yield its full physical medicine, however, Rui had to learn the discipline of mokuso, the 2 minutes of absolute, silent stillness that bridges the gap between a chaotic mind and an intelligent body. He stood on the verge of his daily mobility routine, his mind racing with the tasks of the estate, the cost of grain, and the repairs needed on his scabbard. Sujan reached out and struck the bronze gong, its deep, resonant tone vibrating through the wooden floorboards. "Sit," the master commanded. "Close your eyes. For 2 minutes, you do not exist in the world of doing. You exist only in the world of being. If your mind is traveling through the market while your body is performing these movements, your nervous system will remain deaf to the changes we are trying to make." Rui sat, his eyes closing, his breath slowly settling into the hara pattern he had labored to learn. "My thoughts are like a barrel of monkeys, master. I cannot make them quiet." Do not try to make them quiet, Sujan said softly. Simply bring your eye inward. Feel the exact weight of your sit bones against the wood. Notice where your skin meets the cool air. Listen to the click of the bamboo outside. Bring your entire soul into this room, into this flesh, so that when you move, every nerve fiber is awake and listening. Those 2 minutes of absolute stillness acted as a profound neurological reset. By withdrawing his attention from the external world and anchoring it completely within his physical frame, RUI transitioned from a state of distracted stress to a state of hyper-focused presence. He discovered that when he performed his mobility habits after Mokuso, his movement quality was radically superior. He could feel the exact point where a muscle began to resist. He could adjust his alignment with millimeter precision, and the practice became a form of living meditation rather than a chore to be completed. The apex of his lower body restoration was Tadahisa, the deep asymmetrical squat that the samurai used as a functional resting stance during long hours of sentry duty and strategy councils. For years, RUI had avoided this position, his stiff calves and frozen hip capsules making it completely impossible to lower his glutes below his knees without his heels lifting off the ground or his torso collapsing forward into a ball. A child can sit in a deep squat for an hour while playing in the dirt, Sujan observed, dropping effortlessly into the position, his heels perfectly flat, his spine neutral, his hands resting loosely on his knees. They do not lose this ability because they grow old. They lose it because they are put into schoolhouses with wooden benches. They trade their birthright of total mobility for the convenience of a modern seat. Rui tried to mimic the form, but his hips felt as though they were locked in iron vices, and he began to tip backward onto his spine. My ankles will not bend far enough to let my heels touch the floor, master. Then we will build a bridge for them, Sujan said, sliding a folded woolen mat under RUI's heels. Hold the position at this height. Let the gravity of your torso sink into your pelvic bowl. Spend 2 minutes here every single day. As the tendons in your heels open, we will make the mat thinner. RUI committed to the practice, breaking the 2 minutes into 4 manageable blocks of 30 seconds throughout the day. He squatted while sharpening his arrows. He squatted while inspecting the grain bags. He squatted while reading the maps of the province. Slowly, week by week, the stiffness in his Achilles tendons melted away. The mat became thinner, then vanished entirely. His hips opened like ancient hinges, and after 3 moons of daily practice, he could sit in a deep, flat-footed squat with absolute comfort, his lower back completely free of the old burning pressure that had tortured his adulthood. The final element of the system was Yoru no Shizukesa, the evening release ritual that ensured the compression accumulated during the hours of labor did not follow him into his bed to be locked in by 8 hours of sleep. Every night, after the lamps were extinguished and the temple grew quiet, RUI lay flat on his back on the cold tatami mats, his knees bent at a 90-degree angle, his feet resting flat on the floor. He placed his hands on his ribs and simply allowed his body to surrender its weight entirely to the earth. Most men take the worries and the tight muscles of the day straight into their blankets, Ren whispered from the doorway, his lantern casting long shadows across the screens. They sleep like a coiled spring, and they wonder why they wake up, feeling as though they have been beaten with wooden staves. You must decompress the column before you rest. Arui breathed deeply, feeling his lumbar spine slowly gravitate toward the floor, closing the small gap that tension usually maintained between his back and the mats. My hips feel as though they are wider after these few minutes, Ren. They are, the physician confirmed. You are letting the gravity that compressed you all day work in reverse. Now, draw your right knee slowly to your chest, hold it without straining for 30 seconds, and let the back of your pelvis open. Switch sides, then let your legs go long and take 5 breaths into your hara. RUI followed the sequence precisely, spending 5 minutes in the darkness, allowing every muscle fiber to unclamp its grip on his skeleton. The sleep that followed these releases was deep, dreamless, and profoundly restorative. When he woke at dawn, the heavy, armor-like morning stiffness that he had once accepted as an inevitable sign of aging was entirely absent. His body felt light, clear, and ready to move through the world with the effortless fluidity of water. He had systematically undone the rust of decades, not by pursuing a miraculous cure, but by returning his body to the varied, ancestral demands it had been designed to serve from the very beginning. The answer was not where anyone expected it to be. It was not found in a rare herb from the high mountains, nor was it hidden in a mystical technique reserved for the elite of the shogunate. The freedom of movement that RUI had stolen back from the jaws of early decline lived entirely within the 10 simple micro-habits woven through the ordinary fabric of his day. His body was the blade. Through daily morning oiling with Ragio Taiso, floor living, barefoot connection, and evening decompression, he had discovered that the creeping paralysis men call old age is nothing more than a choice to remain still.